Okay. Well, Michael, thank you for
Great.
hosting tonight. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Andrew, for being here for the presentation. Thank you for everybody for joining us. Andrew, your presentation is going to be on the Washington Franklin offset issues.
That's right.
You've just speaking before the meeting. You've been collecting since you were 15 years old, off and on, and
Yeah, I think that's about right.
Washington Franklin's for the majority of the time, with a couple other focuses and learning from various collectors and clubs and societies, and just looking forward to this chat. You've got a presentation here for us, and we'll do a Q&A afterwards. Everybody will be muted in the meantime. Just feel free to raise your hand or motion if there's a question or anything, and unmute yourself. It's going to be kind of an interactive presentation, as you talked about, Andrew. And yeah, why don't we kick it off and go ahead and share your screen. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody. And Michael, thank you again for setting this up and hosting. Really appreciate it. I think I've met most of the folks on the screen before, but for the folks I haven't met, I'm Andrew Kelley. As Michael said, I'm a longtime Washington Franklin collector. I'm an expert for the APS on the Washington Franklins. My offset exhibit recently won a large gold medal at Chicago PEX, and I'm actually working on a book on the offsets at the moment, which I hope to get out, knock on wood, maybe this year. And so what I thought we would do tonight is just take my exhibit, which is probably too big and way too arcane, and distill it down to like just the basics. What are the most interesting parts of the offsets, and how do we tell them apart? I get a lot of questions from collectors. There's a lot of subtle design differences that get people confused. So I thought I'd show you some interesting stamps and then talk a bit about how to figure out which of them you have. So let me share my screen here, and we'll get started. Everybody see that all right? I will take that as a yes. Admit somebody else here. All right. Okay, so the offsets. First question we get is, why do we call these the offsets? The answer to this is in the printing press for these stamps, you have the printing plate around one cylinder, and then the image from the printing plate transfers onto a rubber offset cylinder that actually makes the image on the stamp paper. And the reason for that rubber offset cylinder is that it let the Bureau of Engraving and Printing use kind of rough surfaced, poor quality paper, but still achieve good results, because the offset blanket sort of flexes, evens out the uneven surface of the paper, and gives a smooth impression. So if you hear about an offset, we're talking about this roller right in the middle, the offset roller. That's one important difference from offset stamps to the others, or to intaglio stamps or engraved stamps. The other important difference is how the offset plates were made. Traditional engraved plates where an engraver makes a die and the die is rolled into a steel plate. The offset process worked almost entirely photographically. The Bureau would pull a die proof from a traditional engraved die. They'd take a picture of it and blow the picture up to like an 8x10, touch up the design, and then use a photographic process to ultimately, through a series of negatives and positives, make a printing plate by photographic means. That let the Bureau crank out printing plates really quickly, which was important. In the offset era, there was a war on, and the Bureau was under enormous pressure to crank out stamps. But it also created a lot of varieties, because all these different steps, there's a piece of dust in the photographic material, or the negative got scratched, prone to lots of damage and other types of varieties, as we will see. So let's talk quickly about just the historical context. I promise this will be brief, and we'll get to the interesting stamp pictures, but it kind of helps explain why the offsets came about and why we're going to talk about them in the order that we are. In the turn of the century, lithography, or offset lithography, was a brand new thing. The Bureau experimented with it a little bit in 1910. Those experiments were apparently unsatisfactory for several years, but finally in 1914, the Bureau started printing revenue stamps by lithography. Then World War I hit, postage rate went up to 3 cents, and suddenly the Bureau couldn't print engraved stamps quickly enough. There's huge demand for 3-cent stamps, and we couldn't get good German printing ink anymore, and the low quality replacement ink wore out it was gritty, and it wore out the printing plates faster than the Bureau could replace them. And so reluctantly, the Bureau turned to offset printing, as you can see there in 1918. Later in 1918, the same gritty ink caught up with the Bureau. They couldn't make 1-cent stamps quickly enough. The public wanted 1-cent stamps so they could uprate 2-cent stamps, uprate postal stationery to the new rate. Started printing those by lithography. Things finally got better in 1919. There were a few experiments that we'll talk about, but the Bureau turned back to engraving. But then shortly after the war tax rate ended and the postage rates went back to 2 cents, the Bureau was hit again by poor quality printing ink that destroyed a bunch of steel plates. And so the Bureau reluctantly had to turn back to lithography for 2-cent stamps in 1920. And then finally, into the era we'll talk about, there was an offset stamp that was in Shanghai, that was overprinted, and a postal forgery of the 2-cent offsets that turned up. Okay, so we talked very briefly about the lithographed predecessors to the offset Washington Franklin's. There's an experimental Hamilton head stamp printed sometime in 1910. We think, unclear whether printed by the Bureau or maybe printed by the post office, as they were experimenting with ways to mass produce stamps. The Bureau actually installed a lithographic press in June of 1910 and made these, called these the Minerva stamps you can see there in the middle, to see whether they could make adequate stamps using lithography. We think the Bureau decided that these stamps looked fine, but they were worried that they were too easy to copy. And so they set lithography aside for postage stamps, but later started printing offset revenue stamps. There are a few examples here you can see. And then ultimately, when the war emergency hit, with the lousy ink, as we said, they finally started printing lithographed postage stamps. So the first lithographed postage stamps were the 3 cents, as we said. Folks have heard about the design types, I believe. Type 3 was the first type. We'll talk in a moment about some of the key attributes of type 3 that distinguish it from type 4. Bureau tried type 3. They thought that the lines were too fine and the image wasn't robust enough. And so they went through that whole process we talked about at the beginning, where they started with a new photograph of a steel die, retouched it, and made a new plate, and came up with type 4. And as you can see, the lines on type 4 tend to be much heavier, has much more color. I actually think it's uglier than type 3, but the Bureau liked it, and that's the design that they used for most of the 3-cent offsets. So key differences to tell these two apart. One key difference is, there are actually 5 key differences. One, you can see on type 3, the P and the O of postage are joined or are separated rather by a line of color. Type 4, they're joined. Another really important difference, and this is the one I use almost always if I'm trying to tell these two stamps apart, on this toga rope here on type 3, there's a line missing. The second line down from the button is gone, whereas that line is there on type 4. That's a really easy difference to spot. It's visible on almost all the stamps. It prints well. So if I'm trying to tell the two apart, that's the one I use. A couple of other differences. The toga button is slightly different, as we'll talk about in a minute, on the two stamps. The nose is different. The nose on type 3 has a really strong curve in this area, whereas it's flat on type 4. And another difference is the outside of the bottom of the head here on type 3 has a line that's kind of a continuous line, whereas on type 4 you can see it's just sort of ragged. There's no kind of line on the outside of the design. I have a chart that I'm going to distribute to everyone on this call that will help you look at these differences at a glance. I don't need to write this down, but I wanted to, I know folks are confused often about how to tell those apart. So I wanted to jump into that. Here's here is the 3-cent portion of the chart that I mentioned. We'll circulate this. There's a download link here. I'll put this link in the chat and we'll review this link again at the end of this presentation, but easy way to take a look at the two stamps and tell them apart. But again, as I said, the one I use almost always is looking for this missing line in the toga rope. This is super reliable. Some of the other attributes here can be harder to see if it's a bad impression or if it's a worn plate, but this line is almost always easy to tell whether that line is there or not. Before I jump on, questions about that? Okay, we'll jump in. I don't want this to be a lecture. If folks have questions or comments, please go off of mute and just jump right on in. One question we get a lot, or I get from collectors a lot, is why are there the imperforate offsets? And the answer to that is the Mailometer company. Mailometer made Shermack vending and affixing machine perforations that mailers would use for envelopes like the one you see here on the right to very quickly attach stamps to envelopes, seal the envelope, and get them in the mail. They were sort of the postage meter equivalent of the 19-teens. And Mailometer made their own coils. The Bureau would give them sheets of 400, and Mailometer would cut them into coils and add their proprietary perforations and then sell them at a markup to mailers to use in their machines. You can see a couple of examples here. A Mailometer would paste sheets together to make long coils. This one example in the middle has a paste up. You can also see the Mailometer was using these big sheets of 400 that have a guideline in the middle, so you can find guideline items. And then Mailometer wasn't blind to the fact that collectors thought that their private coils were highly collectible, and so they made a few blocks, as you can see here, for collectors. We think these blocks are found just on the 3-cent. There's some rumors of them on the 2-cent, but I've never seen one, and Belasco doesn't have one in his book about the private coils. Okay. One really interesting collectible variety on the 3-cent are plate numbers. So remember, in traditional steel plates, plate makers would carefully add plate numbers in the margins of the plates. The offsets was quite different. I recall the offsets were made with a photographic negative. The Bureau would use the same negative over and over and over again for many plates. And so plate makers would just paste in negative numbers in a little gap on that negative and then expose the printing plate. This created a huge number of varieties. You can see there are lots of handmade numbers where the plate makers maybe forgot to paste in a number, and so they would just add the number by hand. Sometimes the whole number, sometimes the parts of numbers. Sometimes they were very careful about how they drew the number. Sometimes they were crude. In a few instances, the Bureau used pictures of a rubber stamp number. There's, I think, a half a dozen places with rubber stamps that are collectible. And in a few places, the Bureau made a mistake. You can see over here on the left, it looks like the Bureau pasted in the plate number mirror imaged. Someone realized it, tried to scrape off the incorrectly mirrored number and then hand make a new number. It's a little unclear to specialists how the Bureau did this. We think they may have actually painted the number right on the printing plate. But I recently discussed this mirror image and corrected number in the US Specialist. Folks had not noticed that correction and hand fix previously. The interesting attribute of the 3-cent stamps are double impressions. There are actually two types of double impressions. On the left, we have a true double impression. In this case, the Bureau was printing stamps, as I said, under enormous pressure to meet war demand. A foreman at the Bureau noticed that a bunch of stamps came out of the press with a really faint impression. That's this impression at the top. The war was on, the Bureau didn't want to waste money or waste time, and so the pressman told the workers to run the stamps through the press again, and they did. The other type of double impression is what I call a pseudo double impression that you can see on the right. These stamps didn't go through the press twice. Rather, there was some difficulty with the press, and it's a little unclear what it was. There may have been a couple of different possibilities, but some difficulty with the press actually made two impressions. We think maybe the Bureau didn't get that offset roller clean, or maybe it's a vibration of the press, maybe been something else. But you very commonly see these stamps with a faint first impression and a stronger second impression. The way to tell these two apart, if you're interested in collecting them, is that the pseudo double impressions are always perfectly aligned in the vertical direction and just offset in the horizontal direction. You can see here the two impressions line up perfectly vertically, not horizontally. The true doubles tend to be offset in two different directions. You can see this, the first impression on the true double is offset both vertically and horizontally. The true doubles tend to be, in my experience, much less common than the pseudo double impressions, but most dealers and collectors don't appreciate the difference, and so you can often acquire them for your collection at about the same price. All right, another interesting variety on the 3 cents are triple impressions, and these have a bit of a sordid history. I have an article actually, I have an article on these coming out in the next couple of months in The Specialist, but it turns out that this variety was discovered about at the time the stamps were current. No one thought about it for 70 years. And then I believe in the early 90s, a couple of examples, a couple of triple impressions were certified and the Scott catalog listed it. The complicating factor, though, is that if you look carefully at the certified examples, I'm going to jump back for a second, they all look just like the pseudo double impression. Right, this is just 2 impressions, but you can see down here in the numbers at the bottom, it really looks like there are 3 sets of 3s. So a bunch of these got certified incorrectly as triple impressions. The Scott catalog listed it. It's clear that those are not actually triple impressions, but I found a couple that I think are. If you see the stamp on the left, we have the main impression here. There's a very faint impression up here at the top, and then another faint impression over here to the right. I think this is a combination of a pseudo double impression and a true double impression. And then the stamp on the right is even harder to, it's hard to see the impressions, but there's a clear double impression above, which would have to be a true double impression, and then another pseudo impression over to the right, giving the stamp almost an over inked appearance. But under magnification or using contrast filters in Photoshop, it's clear there are multiple stamp impressions on the used stamp as well. And as far as I know, these are the only two extant examples of a triple impression that are actually triple impressions. A couple other fun multiple impressions on the offsets. One, you can find both type 3 and type 4 printed on both sides. There's a big debate among collectors about what happened. This may well be an economy measure where we had a faint impression and then the Bureau just turned the paper over and reprinted it. There's also some speculation that these may be the result of sheets that the Bureau ran through a press to clean it and then reused either accidentally or purposefully. The other really interesting multiple impression is this block at the bottom. The 2 stamps at the left are type 3. All the rest of the stamps are type 4. The Smithsonian has the plate block from this sheet, and so we can look at it and tell which plates were used for the 2 impressions, and we can see that those plates were at press about a month apart. So we think what happened was the Bureau had a partial print on a piece of paper. For some reason, either press shut down or multiple sheets of paper went through the press at once or something. Just two partial impressions. Looks like the Bureau set that sheet of paper aside and then purposefully reused it a month later. We see that on this 3 cent block. There are also some examples of a 3 cent block where the stamps are 3 cent and there's a 1 cent plate number in the margin. So it looks like the Bureau was super focused on conserving paper and conserving resources and went to pretty extreme measures to reuse paper. Some other interesting printing freaks here. You can see we have a partial impression probably from 2 sheets of paper feeding through the press. You have these really faint impressions, which may have been due to a worn plate or some inking under ink plate. When the offset plates were worn out or underwatered, we would end up with blurry impressions where we would have sort of excessive inking on the plate. And you can see a partial impression here, probably from a press startup, unclear. And of course, find lots of preprint paper folds like the block at the bottom. The 3-cent stamps are also notorious for having a huge number of shades. These are a couple of pages from my exhibit, and you can see the stamps range from a very pale lilac all the way to deep, deep purple, both type 3 and type 4. In general, you'll find the type 3 stamps tend to be type 3 stamps tend to be more of a purple or a lilac color. Type 4 tend to be more this sort of a deeper purple shade. And Steve just texted me with a message. Yeah, good point. Let's jump back quickly to the printed on both sides. One really important thing here for collectors to understand is that there are also lots of offset stamps, as we'll discuss, where there's a set-off impression on the back. A fairly common variety of the offsets, much less valuable than the printed on both sides. The important thing here is you can tell that this is not a set-off because the orientation of the image matches the orientation of a properly printed stamp. The set-offs on the back, as we'll talk about, are mirrored, and so they would not have the same orientation. So that's a good point, Steve. Thanks for messaging me. Okay, another fun variety on the offsets. I have an article about this coming out as well. The Bureau, again, is an effort to save paper. The Bureau would often have, Bureau often print sheets where part of the sheet was fine, or part of a press sheet was fine, part of it was defective. We think that the Bureau wanted to save the part of the sheet that was fine and mark the one that was defective to make sure someone threw it away. So you can see here on the left is a sheet of 100, a post office pane of 100 of the type 4 3-cent offset. Really faint impression on the left. My guess is that when this was part of a larger press sheet, these were printed in sheets of 400, the stamps that would have been on the sheet over on the right would have been fine. So Bureau wanted to mark this sheet to throw it away and keep the rest of the sheet. And so they would apply this surface division hand stamp here. You can sort of see it very faintly in this enlargement, but it looks like the mark at the bottom. They would put that mark on the sheet to indicate to an inspector to pull the sheet out of production later. But in a number of instances, we think the inspectors just missed it and issued them to the public. So there are maybe a dozen of these known for the 3 cents, and one example on the 1 cent and one example on the 2 cent that we'll see a little later. And then I think this is the last 3-cent slide. These stamps were perforated in one direction at a time. The Bureau would feed the sheets through the rotary perforators. And so if the stamp paper got folded during that process, you would wind up with some pretty wonky, crazy perforations, as you can see. We have some folds that happened before any perforations were applied, like the example here at the left. Sometimes the Bureau would perforate the sheet successfully in one direction, but then the paper would fold when they applied perforations in the other direction. Sometimes the Bureau that would be an example like the one at the upper right. Sometimes I think the perforator operators just misfed the sheet, and so you have a few 3-cent stamps with perforations right down the middle. And then we also see, particularly on the 3 cent, but sometimes on the 1 cent, it looks like the perforators were made up of wheels of pins, the rotating wheels, and the wheels could be moved around. And we think sometimes one of the wheels just got loose particularly on the outside of the sheet and just migrated off the edge of the sheet. And so we'll often find 3 cent and 1 cent offsets where either there's no perforations at top or bottom like this one, or where the top or bottom perforations are quite far away from the top of the stamp. Okay, those are the 3 cents. Before I turn to the 1 cent, any questions or comments or questions? No? All right, we will keep going, but please, I don't want this to be a monologue. Please jump in if there are, if you've got questions. Oh, Wayne, looks like you said you wanted to revisit double impressions.
I have a question if you don't mind. Did the when the perforation shift on the roller, did that cause imperf betweens?
Yes, but particularly on the 1 cent. There's a famous
Okay.
1 cent variety we'll get to in just a minute, where one of the perforation wheels either dropped out or rotated off of the press. I think, to my knowledge, most of the other imperforates were caused by paper folds, not by perforating wheels migrating out. Although I'm not absolutely certain of that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And then Wayne, you said, I saw in the chat that you had a question about double impressions. Wayne still on? Are you
Yeah.
muted?
Could you,
Hey.
yeah, just unmuted. Could you go back
Yeah.
to the double impression and pseudo double impression?
Yeah.
So my question, and you're more familiar with this than I am probably,
Mhm.
but my own observation is that these stamps went through the press head to toe, through the sheet version of it. And it would seem to me that these are reversed. The true double would be a much stronger, much similar impression, whereas what you're calling the true double, where it's even almost at a slight angle, would be more like a random kiss print or something like this.
Mhm.
Is there?
Yeah. These actually went through nose first.
It did go through nose first.
It did, yeah. In fact, you can see one example, or is that one example of that is this partial impression where the press
Right.
would have picked up ink or was under inked. So yeah, they would have gone through traveled through in this direction, nose first.
But wouldn't the true double impression have been, they would have taken much more care to line up the impression if at all possible. I mean, it's a sheet fed, so they had some control over it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm jumping back. So we think on the true doubles that either that there was some vibration in the press, or there's some talk that the rubber offset roller and the printing plate weren't perfectly aligned, and so the impression from the printing plate wouldn't fall on the offset in exactly the same spot on the offset roller at every rotation. And so we think, we think that that is what generated these varieties. The other piece of evidence is that we have some contemporaneous reports on the 3 cent of pressmen running stamps through twice. There's a story that Joel quotes about a guy who actually found some of these in the post office and ultimately went to the bureau and talked to a pressman on the floor and said, "Oh, your foreman says that these doubles are created by the blanket slipping, by the press slipping," and the pressman said, "No, that's not true. And actually, we were working all night. We had to get stamps out, and so we just printed them twice." Anyway, we have that documentation in the 3 cent where we see both of these types of doubles. On the 2 cent, though, we see just these pseudo double impressions like this, and not the true doubles, and at least no reports of the bureau intentionally printing twice. So not absolute confirmation, but
okay. So one follow up where and I'm sorry, I'm just
this is
these out.
super interesting.
What you're calling the pseudo double,
Mm-hmm.
the reason that would be more of a true double to me is, again, it's much closer to the impression. When you're dealing with a blanket slippage, you've already had a single impression, so there's much less ink left on the plate. So it would, in theory, be a much lighter impression, wouldn't it? More like what you're calling the true double.
I think that's true. I have I must have 20 or 30 of these in my collection, and the one here is the strongest. Most of them have the second impression that's much less heavy than what you see here. And sometimes it looks just sort of smeared, as if the press was vibrating. But yeah, it's an interesting question. We should maybe chat about that more offline. Yeah. Certainly, and I will say the other thing. This is the fallacy of appealing to authority, but the sort of the received wisdom amongst the Washington Franklin offset nerds are categorized as the stamps as I have here. But if that's wrong, that certainly would be interesting. The other, I guess, the one other factor, and this is all coming to coming to me that I think about it. One other piece of evidence, Wayne, is we find these true doubles in plate blocks with two different plate numbers. And we don't with the pseudos like this style. There's still doubled plate numbers, but it's always the same number. So again, not definitive proof about which one is which, but it certainly suggests at least the stamps that look like true doubles were printed from two different plates. I'll send you. There are a couple of articles about that. I'll send you scans of those plate blocks. Okay, let's jump to the 1 cent. I'll jump ahead here. Okay, so as we said, the Bureau hoped they wouldn't have to make 1 cent lithograph stamps. They didn't like making the 3 cent stamps that much, but they lost the race to make enough 1 cent stamps for people to use to make up the postage to the new 3 cent war tax rate. Happily or unhappily for collectors, depending on your view, there's just one design type for the 1 cent, so you don't have to try to distinguish between the types. Again, we have the perforate stamps, we have imperforates that were made for the mail-o-meter company, and then you can see there the mail-o-meter company Schermack Type 3 perforations. Again, there's an example on the right. So far as I know, there are no blocks of the 1 cent, just the actual coils. Like the 3 cents, there's some fun plate number varieties on the 1 cent stamps. You can see in a few spots, it seems pretty clear that a worker scribed the plate number directly onto the printing plate. You also see the Bureau would occasionally mix and match numbers as they were putting plate blocks together. You can see this 5 even has a little gap, or maybe when they pasted the number on the plate, they didn't butt the numbers together perfectly. And we also see kind of hand painted numbers like we saw on the 3 cent stamps. Lots of shades as well. Again, this is a close-up of a page from my exhibit. They're really a huge number of shades. The Scott catalog lists a couple of them like emerald and dark green, but there are wide variations between the shades. And it can be very difficult to, particularly in the 1 cent, to distinguish different shades because you'll have heavier or lighter impressions, which make it hard to judge the ink color. I don't have it in the presentation, but I even have a block in my exhibit where half of the block is one shade and the other half is much lighter and it's a different shade. And it looks like there's just an uneven inking of the plate. On the 3 cents, again, we see what I've called the pseudo doubles with subject to Wayne's caveat in our discussion. We also have what collectors think are true doubles. You can see here the second impression is offset above the first impression. I've seen a number of these, what I call true doubles here, where the impression is offset vertically. I've never seen one of those where it's offset in two different directions, like we saw for the 3 cent before. So, like, somewhat unclear whether it's a true double impression or not. No plate blocks for this one with two numbers, as far as I know. But if you're flipping through a dealer stock and you see a double impression that looks like the one on the left, definitely a less common variety and something you might want to add to your collection.
Andrew.
Yes.
527A seems to be a rather common double impression. Is that a true or a pseudo?
The Scott catalog calls both of these 527. 527 or 525. This is 525.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, often we'll come across 527As in, sales and auctions. It's rather common. Is that considered a true double or a pseudo double?
Well, it says the 527 is a 2 cent stamp, and I think I'm not aware of any true doubles on the 2 cent stamps, so it'd have to be a pseudo double.
Okay.
Good question. All right, so printing freaks. Again, you can see we have the heavily inked or under inked plates, weird tiger stripes. This is maybe a plate wiping issue. At least I'm not sure. And then to Steve's point that I was talking about earlier, we also see stamps for all three denominations that have a set off on the back. And you can see this is different from the printed on both sides that we talked about before, because it's a set off, it's mirrored, right? George Washington is facing the other direction. These are still quite collectible, but they're not nearly as rare or as valuable as the true printed on both sides varieties. And of course, the printed on both sides varieties are only found on the 3 cent, not on the 1 cent or the 2 cent. Similar perforation varieties, the ones we talked about before. 2 notes here. First, this plate block has a good example of the perforating wheel wandering away, nice wide imperforate at top. And then someone asked a question before about, I think it was maybe with Scotty, about whether the wandering perforating wheels have ever have caused any imperforate between varieties. And the answer to that is yes. A wandering wheel or a wheel dropping out, or a number of sheets of 525 that were perforated without the perforating wheel between the 9th and the 10th column of stamps. One word of caution on these: all or nearly all of this imperforate between variety has a straight edge on the right from the edge of the sheet. If you see one of these that's perforated on all 4 sides, I'd be really cautious and definitely get an expert certificate. They're almost all with a straight edge like that. Okay, one other interesting 1 cent variety. In the summer of 1919, the Bureau experimented with a perforator from the Rosbeck company that would allow it to perforate stamps in both directions at once. And so the Bureau, I think, was hopeful that that would speed up stamp perforation and give them some additional efficiencies. The perforator used a really small perforation gauge, perf 12.5, rather than perf 11 for the rest of the offsets. A pretty small experiment. It was completely a complete failure. The Bureau perforated about 7,000 sheets of stamps. It had to throw away half of them because they were so badly perforated that they were unusable. Even the stamps that the Bureau actually issued are notorious for poor centering. You can find a nicely centered example like this. That's a really nice find. The stamps were issued. The Bureau persuaded the post office to use the stamps to save money. They couldn't bring themselves to throw them away, even though I think it cost them about 7 cents per thousand to make a postage stamp in that day. Used almost exclusively in Washington, or excuse me, sold exclusively in Washington, D.C., and used almost exclusively from the main post office there. You can see in the middle, this is the earliest known use. Oops, sorry, the stamp was issued a couple of days before this, but earliest known use. We do have a very few perforation freaks on the Rosbecks. This is the only one I know about. I'm sure there are some others out there. And then we think there was a one pane of this Rosbecks that was issued without any vertical perforations. No one seems to have any idea how that came about, given that the machine was supposed to perforate in both directions at once. But there are some of those floating around out there. The real challenge with this stamp is finding uses, period, and finding uses that are not on postcards from Washington. Almost all the stamps are used on postcards from the main post office. So if you can find a first-class use like the one here on the right, that's quite desirable. This use to Jamaica here is the only use of this stamp abroad that I'm aware of. Super nice use. And then there are a few oddball uses. You can see this one was used in Guam. I think there's also a usage of the stamp known by the AEF in Siberia. Probably philatelic, but also super unusual. Any use of this stamp is tough, and any use that's not just a postcard is doubly so. Okay. Before I venture into the 2 cent stamps, any other comments or questions? All right. Well, as I said, the 2 cent offsets were printed quite some time after the Bureau stopped printing the 1 cent stamps and the 3 cent stamps. The Bureau seems to have not liked lithography very much. I think it went against their traditions of fine engraved work, had some concerns about the quality and potentially about forgery. And the Bureau knew that the postage rate was going to change in 1920 and go back from 3 cents to 2 cents. They had stocked up lots and lots of engraved plates to make sure they could print enough stamps and so they wouldn't have to use lithography. But then disaster struck again. The Bureau got a bad batch of ink. It destroyed most of the 2-cent engraved plates before the Bureau realized what was happening. And to meet demand, the Bureau again had to turn back to lithography. As with, and I think unlike the other offsets, the Bureau really struggled to get a design of the 2-cent stamp that was satisfactory. Lots of experimentation and fiddling to try to get a good variety, which generated all the quote die types, the design types. First one is type 4. Issue. This is the cover you see here was the first day the type 4 was placed on sale in Washington, D.C., March 15th of 1920. There are a couple of these that were used, I think, in Cleveland a few days before, but first day of sale in D.C. This cover was nice because it was actually prepared by Henry Hammelman, who was a pioneer first day cover servicer. You'll see his really distinctive script on a lot of early first day covers. Anyway, over on the right are the main types of type 4. You have the perforate, imperforate as before, and then also the Shermack type 3 perforations again. This strip at the bottom is particularly noteworthy because it marks the transition when Shermack or Mailometer went from using the engraved stamps that you see on the left to using the offset stamps on the right. I think there are 3 or 4 of these combination pairs that are recorded. We'll talk about the 2-cent design types in more detail in a minute, but the key thing if you're trying to tell the type 4 2-cent from the others is to look at the toga button. The toga button makes a kind of a DID or a reverse D and a line and a D. And unlike all the other types, the top of the toga line tends to be very weakened and broken. This is a really easy way to distinguish these stamps. The other thing you'll see as you work with the offsets more often is that the design is just much lighter. The lines are lighter, there's less color. And so you can very often just look at a type 4 and realize the design just looks much different than the others and pick it out that way. The Bureau didn't like this design. It thought, again, the lines were too faint and there wasn't enough color. So it made a new design, which was type 5, much heavier lines, as you can see, much more intense color. This is Scott 530 or 527 and 533. 533 is a fairly unusual stamp, fairly rare offset stamp, particularly tough on cover. This used to go back here, or to Sweden here rather. Here is quite nice. The key ways to distinguish this stamp are to make sure that all the dots in the nose are present, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. The toga rope and toga lines much different than we saw on type 4, and then the line in the left 2 tends to be fairly weak, and then I'm sorry, I'm not articulating this very clearly. There are some differences in the dots on the upper lip as well that would distinguish this from one of the other types, but we'll deal with that in more detail in a minute. Comparing them at one time will be simpler. So that's type 5. The Bureau accidentally made type 5A. It looks like the Bureau was making some a new glass positive or a new master negative with the sort of same original negative they're using for type 5, but a piece of dust landed on the negative and blocked out a couple of dots in the nose. And so the only difference between type 5 and type 5A is this gap in the nose. Collectors didn't realize that there were different types until after the stamps were current. That's one of the reasons that type 5 is less common. People just didn't know that it existed, and so they didn't save any. This is by far the most common of the 2-cent types, and so if you're not sure what you have, chances are pretty good that it's this type. Type 6. It's an interesting story. Apparently, an individual plate maker at the Bureau didn't like the look of the line in the left 2, and so of his own initiative, he just He made the line heavier before making a new glass positive, and then making new plates. So this design is really notable by the thickness of that line in the left too. It's so pronounced it almost looks like it's going to cut the two in half. So again, you can see examples here of the three, the perforated, private perforated, imperforate types. The cover on the right points up an interesting issue for all of the offset stamps. The main consumer of the offsets was Mail-O-Meter Company to make their Shermack coils. There are very few uses of the imperforate without private perforations that are not philatelic. Almost all of the examples were used by stamp collectors. But here we have it on an economist corner card. You have earlier, you can see this guy has these huge jumbo singles, almost certainly created by a collector. And so to my mind, there's actually an interesting question whether stamp dealer mail really is the definitive commercial use of these stamps or not, because the public really just wasn't cutting up sheets of offset stamps to put them on their mail. The last offset type is type 7. This is another type that collectors discovered long after the stamps were current, which accounts for the reason why the perforate stamp is not super rare, but the imperforate here is much, much rarer, orders of magnitude rarer than the other offset types. Reason for that, collectors didn't realize it existed, and stamp dealers and collectors would stock up on imperforate stamps, but because the type 7 was issued last, collectors and dealers had already stocked up on the other types, didn't buy a bunch of new imperforates while the stamp was current, and so wound up just by inadvertence not saving a lot of copies. Super tough stamp. It's, I guess it's scarce but not rare imperforate. These are a pretty penny, but you can find one in most fancy auctions. The Shermack type 3 perforations are quite uncommon. I think Belasco estimates there are about 20 pairs or so of those. The imperforate used on cover, super rare. I think there are 4 uses on cover. Only 2 of them actually have a dated circular date stamp. There's one that's in period, that's stamp dealer mail. This is the other one, obviously slightly out of period, but at least not obviously stamp dealer mail, although as I said, it's almost certainly philatelic. Other interesting rarity here, the Shermack mailing machines were designed to attach stamps one at a time. And so this is actually the only known use of a multiple of Scott 534B on cover with or without private perforations. And for reasons that are unclear, I was able to buy this on eBay for the price of an ordinary 534B with Shermack's used on cover, which is a really nice find. All right, as I powered through the differences in designs before, but let's pause here for a minute, because really the best way to figure out what's offset you have is sort of compare the various design types. So, and as I said before, you folks can have a downloaded version of this chart. But if you sort of run through the columns here, it's easy to see what are the relevant differences for telling apart the different types. And there are a few things I will point out to you. One is if the toga button has this kind of DID design, as I said, you can be confident you have a type 4. You don't need to look at any other designs. If you have a really strong left 2, you're confident you have a type 6. You don't need to look at anything else. If you have a gap in the nose, then you know you have type 5A. You don't really need to look at anything else. And then if you look at if your stamp has 3 rows of dots on the upper lip, you know you have type 7. And if it has 2 rows of dots, then it's got to be one of the other types. So you kind of doing a differential diagnosis with this chart can be a really helpful way to figure out what offset stamp you've got. I will also say I'm happy to, if folks ever on this call ever have questions about it, or you're having trouble figuring out what type a particular stamp is, I'm happy to take a look at a scan or talk to you on the phone or what have you. If you type a few of these, you'll quickly get the hang of it. Are there questions about that? Right. Well, let's jump through a few other fun varieties. Uniquely on the 2 cent is another type of private perforation, which we call the Wilson roulette. This roulette was made with a sewing machine by a guy named Jacob Wilson in 1923. Wilson was in the business of selling large margined blocks, plate blocks, and other blocks to stamp dealers. He would wholesale them. We think that Wilson had to either pledge some stamps to a bank to get a loan, or perhaps gave some stamps to a bank to pay off a loan. But as the story has it, the bank didn't want the stamps if they didn't have separations. And so Wilson apparently rouletted the stamps to make them usable to the bank. He may also have rouletted his scrap after he cut out his large blocks. The unused stamps are reasonably common. I think if you looked on eBay right now, you could probably find a few examples. Herman Hurst, the famous stamp dealer, popularized these in the 40s. Almost all of the genuine examples have his signature on the back, as you can see for this block. These tend to be super, super rare on cover. I think there are 8 known uses on cover, which is the bad news. The good news is that collectors often don't recognize them. So if you're on eBay and you see a cover used in Pittsburgh in 1923 and it's got some funky looking separations, might be worth checking that out to see whether it's a Wilson roulette or not. I found this one on eBay and again, didn't pay much for it. I think the seller didn't appreciate what was on offer. Okay, some fun plate number and plate marginal marking varieties on the offsets. I'll start with the funky plate numbers. Again, you'll see the Bureau hand making numbers. These are less common on the 2 cent than they are on the 1 cent or the 3 cent. Looks like things were a little more under control, perhaps. Maybe the Bureau is under less time pressure, but you can still find a few funky numbers where they're handmade rather than being made with type. The other big innovation with the 2 cent was the Bureau did a lot of experimenting with using much larger plates to print the stamps. So instead of printing a plate of 400, the Bureau would print from a plate that had 800 subjects or even 1600 subjects. They would be sort of multiple images of a 400 subject plate on one larger size plate. We think that the Bureau was having trouble when it would guillotine those the large sheets down into smaller sheets. It would guillotine a whole stack of subjects. They have problems with the cut not falling in the same place on all of the sheets. And so when sheets were badly miscut, you would wind up with a funky variety like this one at the left, where there's 2 plate numbers, one plate number from the 400 subject, the plate image below, another one from the 400 subject plate image above. And so to try to solve that, we see a lot of 2 cent offset plates where the Bureau has scribed, probably a pressman has scribed a line on the very top of the sheet. And we think the purpose of that line was to give the pressman a clue about where to feed the paper so that they'd be able to feed the paper so the impression would fall in the same spot on every sheet. And so when a big stack of sheets was guillotined apart, all the images would be cut correctly rather than getting a miscut like the one at the left. Another variety, this is one of my favorite varieties. In early 1920, the pressmen at the Bureau apparently decided to scratch their initials in a printing plate before they printed from it. Unclear exactly why they did that. We think probably to mark their work, so that if there's a stack of bad work, they would know who generated it. These printing plates tended to have a really short lifetime. So oftentimes the Bureau would print from the printing plates for just a day, and then the plate would be worn out. And so a single pressman would have access to most plates. The most prolific of the monogrammers was a guy named Otto A. Myers. His monogram appears on, I think, about 20 plates. This one was his first monogram. You can see he got had a much more fancier and a flourish to it as time went on. There's one plate here in the middle where we think Otto A. Myers started with a plate. He must have been called away. Maybe he got sick. And so a different pressman, Ralph Wershing, took over in the middle. And so you can find some of these plates with plate 11495 with just Myers monogram, and then some that have both because it was added in the middle of the press run. So those are a fun variety to track down, and a few of them are quite uncommon. The Myers ones tend to be easy to find. Some of these others, Walter Bodeker and Cleveland Topley, tend to be and a few others tend to be much harder to find. Another interesting variety that's found particularly on the 2 cents are efforts to retouch individual printing plates. On the screen, you'll see a couple of the more famous varieties. One is this retouch in the P of postage. You can see comes from the stamp right here. I think the Bureau had a big white spot on the plate because of some problems with the printing materials that I talked about before. And so we think a pressman either scratched the design onto the plate or perhaps painted some emulsion onto the plate or plate maker rather, to fix it. Another very famous variety is what's called the retouch on cheek. We think Washington had a huge white spot on his cheek, again, due to some defect in the printing materials. And a pressman or a plate maker, again, hand retouched the plate. The really interesting thing about this is that I found two versions of this retouch. Most of them have less of a retouch than you can see there in red, but a few of them had this really heavy retouch. And what we think was perhaps the Bureau painted the retouch on the plate, and then as the plate wore down, some of the material wore off. But the retouches are mysterious. They tend to be a source of continuing research and investigation. And I think there'll be some more discoveries to be made here. For example, we don't know what plate this particular retouch came from, and if we could figure that out and find the plate proof, we could learn some more about the genesis of that variety. More commonly, we see what we call constant minor varieties. These come from scratches or defects in the photographic material that we talked about, rather than a defect in a particular plate. So for example, on the left is what we call the CRNTS variety, because this defective E looks a little bit like an R. This is found on dozens of printing plates because the Bureau used the same negative with the same defect over and over and over again. Similarly, on the right, this scratch through 2 and EN appears on dozens of printing plates, again, because the Bureau used the same negative over and over again with the same defect. So there are literally hundreds of these varieties and lots of additional varieties to be discovered. Paper folds are fun. This is a variety that I discovered recently. Scott Catalog has started listing paper folds like this, where a piece of or an impression is missing or elsewhere, as a distinct catalog listed variety. And so the block on the right, it was the basis for the new Scott 527D in the catalog. You can see there's a paper fold, and so part of the stamp image is on the back. After I bought this and Scott decided to list it, I was lucky enough to find another example on the left. So far as I know, these are the only 2 color missing varieties on the offsets, but if someone finds another one, I'd be interested in hearing about that. We also have that service division rejection marking that we talked about on the 3 cent. I can find that on the 2 cent as well. This, I think, is the only example that's known on the 2 cent, probably caused by a piece of paper that didn't feed correctly, maybe double feed of paper through the press, rather overlapping this sheet. Again, the Bureau wanted to save the remaining panes, which were probably fine, stamped it, intended that the inspector would pull it out, and then it was accidentally issued. For printing freaks, on the far left and far right are set-offs from setting a piece of paper on top of a wet sheet. And as you can see, because it's a set-off, it's a mirror image. Block on the left actually has 2 different set-offs. There's a set-off at a different angle that's kind of hidden in the main subjects. Block on the right is a large block showing you those set-offs on reverse. We think These may have been, these may have been caused by setting a piece of paper on a wet sheet. I think there's also some possibility that when the Bureau cycled the offset press without a piece of paper in the press, or maybe with a piece of paper misfed in the press, the offset roller would transfer ink onto the pressure roller, which would then transfer onto the back of the next sheet of paper. And so these may be the result of running the press once without a piece of paper and then running another sheet through it. Again, and then in the middle, we call this tinted paper. As the offset plates wore out, they would, the white, for reasons we could explain if folks are curious, the white areas would start picking up ink. And so you see a few of these sheets where there's sort of a slight inky haze across much of the impression. All of the offsets can be found with what are called phantom plate numbers. You can see that those are these ghostly looking plate numbers in the margins of the stamps. These were caused by a roller in the printing press on the outfeed of picking up ink, wet ink from a sheet, and then transferring it further down on the same sheet. These tend to be by far the most common on the 2-cent offsets, although there are a few examples on the 1 cent and the 3 cent. Also, for some reason, much more common on the bottom than the top, probably based on the configuration of the press. Some people speculate that the fact that these are found on some offsets and not others suggests the Bureau used different offset presses for different issues. I think that may be right, but that's the subject of some ongoing research. I think Wayne will like this one. This is sometimes called a print hickey. This variety was created because there was some foreign matter on the offset roller when the piece of paper went through the press, piece of string or a stick or something like that. The foreign matter, if you can imagine, sort of gets pressed into the offset roller, and so there's a little bridge or a little gap on the offset roller that won't touch the paper as it goes through the press. That's why you get this sort of white line around the edge of the foreign object, and then a really heavy kind of blurred impression from the foreign object itself. My guess is that these exist on all of the offset issues, but this is the only example that I have seen. And there's an article about this in The Specialist from, I think, 2021, perhaps. I can circulate that if folks are interested. A couple more varieties, and we're drawing to the end and we'll take questions. There are some shades on the 2-cent offsets. They tend to be much less shade variety here than there were for the 1 cent and the 3 cent. War was over. The Bureau had ink under better control, and so we tend to see just a few distinct shades on a couple of the issues. In my experience, the Scott catalog's listing of shades on the 2 cent captures most of the variety we see, whereas on the other issues, as I said, there are literally hundreds of shade varieties. Some more perforation freaks, same cause as what we talked about before. Scotty had asked about imperforate between. Scott, this is type 5A. For sure, this was caused by a paper fold. You can flip it over and see the fold. You can also kind of line up the weird alignment in the perfs from a fold. I think the other 2 cent imperforate between varieties are also caused by paper folds. They tend to be very rare and affect just a couple of stamps, but I'm not absolutely positive about that.
Andrew, question.
Yeah.
You mentioned in the last screen about the color variations of the ink. Are there, I noticed earlier on the 1 cent, emerald listed as a color.
Yeah.
That's something typically we don't see on the engraved stamps. Is that ink specific to the offset, the emerald color?
The offset ink had a different formulation than the intaglio ink. So I think the answer is yes, although I couldn't tell you whether there are similar colored engraved stamps or not.
Yeah, I just typically when you see emerald listed, it's not something that we see typically on the other WFs. So I would explain it. Okay.
And I will say too, there is huge confusion about which color is which. I mean, I've talked to some folks who I think are pretty amazing Washington Franklin experts and pretty amazing stamp experts, and we debate a lot about which color is which and what color the catalog is referring to. So I think I know what emerald is. I'm sure I know what dark green is on the 1 cent, but it's a little bit of a mess.
Okay.
A couple last 2 slides, or last 3 slides. So as I mentioned, this is the last offset stamp that the Bureau, or last Bureau printed offset stamp that was issued. As folks know, we had a postal agency in Shanghai, China. For a time, the postal agency overprinted stamps in local currency so they could sell stamps in local currency and not require U.S. currency, which was an inconvenience. The Bureau overprinted most of those, but in 1922, the agency ran out of Bureau overprinted 1 cent and 2 cent stamps and received permission from the Bureau to overprint the stamps locally. Overprinted a handful of 1 cent and 2 cent stamps. To the dismay of the folks in the postal agency, they were incredibly popular with collectors who bought almost all of them. Very few were actually purchased and used on mail. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Very few used on mail, and shortly after the stamps were issued, the Shanghai post office actually closed. There was a treaty on the limitation of armaments, and all of the countries who were signatories to that treaty agreed to close their postal agencies in Shanghai. And so on December 31st at 5 p.m., which is when this was canceled, the U.S. Postal Agency closed, wrapped up business, and these stamps are not valid for use on postage any longer. So kind of a fun way to end our offset discussion. And then the last thing I would note is that the Bureau never again printed stamps entirely by, or postage stamps entirely by offset lithography. And collectors, or at least I think one of the main reasons for that was they realized they were much easier to copy than engraved stamps, right? There's a reason our money is engraved. And I think that was borne out. There's actually a postal forgery of the offset stamps that had appeared ironically after the offset stamps were no longer being produced by the Bureau. It has a bit of an interesting history, which I'll touch on very briefly here. And so the history is a stamp dealer actually found this postal forgery, a guy named Edward Stern, at his stamp shop on Nassau Street in February of 1922. You can see there's a block of the stamps that he found there. It's sort of interesting. I wrote an article about this at The Specialist a couple of months ago, but Stern bought up the forgeries, I think suggested to the New York Times that he was doing so as a public service and that he planned to turn them over to the Bureau. But then a whole bunch of them have turned up on the market and there's no other reports besides Stern's. So it seems that he maybe bought them and decided to sell a few to collectors. So Stern finds the stamps in 1922. And fast forward to 1923, a German printer in Toledo named Anton Winter was arrested for forging postage stamps. The cover here was actually sent by his prosecutor to prove that Winter's forgeries were good enough to carry the mail. As you can see, they were. So Winter pled guilty, sent off to prison. And then after he was in prison, a bunch of the forgeries turned up on mail used in and around New York. The forgery was called the Brooklyn forgery, based on those uses. Although interestingly, I think this is the only cover where the forgery was used from Brooklyn. Almost all the other uses were from Manhattan or the other boroughs. But this was the first cover that showed up in the philatelic press. And so I think that the forgery got its name from that fact. So it's really a three-phase forgery. The stamp dealer found the forger arrested in Toledo, and then after he's in jail for some reason, a bunch of forgeries turn up on the mail.
Hence the term stamp out crime.
Yeah. So that's there's something in the chat. That's the this is the Whirlwind tour. I would say, again, copy down these links, particularly the link to that design type chart. I found that is super helpful in distinguishing the various types. I also have a link here to the key book about the offsets by Donald Leibarger. This is a link to the APRL where you can download the book for free. And as I said, I'm more than happy to talk about offsets or to answer questions or help figure out types. And so if you have a stamp you're struggling with, send me an email. We can have a Zoom. You can send me a scan, what have you. So let me stop sharing. Oops, I misclicked here. Stop sharing, and hope that was helpful. If questions, if folks want to go over the design types again, Wayne, want to talk about double impressions again? I'm happy to. Yeah, Wayne, I think the answer to your question ultimately, Wayne, is the plate blocks. That the true double impressions have two different plate numbers that are offset the same way to the same degree as the impressions, and the pseudo doubles have two plate numbers, or have the same plate number doubled, but just doubled left to right. So I think the plate numbers at least give you some indication that the true doubles went through the press twice, and suggest that the pseudo doubles didn't, although I suppose it's possible that they went through twice and were better aligned. I think I'm not sure, Wayne, I'm not sure you're here for this, but before you joined, I was pointing out that you were my instructor at my very first stamp can class longer ago than we will talk about. So it's intimidating to get the production questions. Yeah, Mark. Yes. You're on mute, Mark. There you go. We're not hearing you.
I never saw tiny URL before. What is that?
It's just a way to make really long web links shorter. Right. The actual link to that file is way too long to type, so you can tiny URL makes it a little easier. Let me put those. I'm going to put those links in the chat too, so folks can. Mark, did you get your audio working?
No, can't hear him.
No, maybe Mark, could you type your question into the chat maybe? All right. Oh, shades in different colors. Yep. Mark, I think everyone, to answer your question, Mark, I think everyone struggles with that. There's really not, particularly for the offsets, there's no good color guide. Roy White has his color and philately book, but didn't cover the offsets. And the offsets are extra hard, I think, because I'm sure what the right way to describe the intensity of the impression or the amount of ink on the printing plate can affect your perception of the color. Like I said, I have blocks in a plate block in my exhibit where I swear that the left stamp is emerald and the right stamp is green and the middle stamp is somewhere in between, because there was an inking issue as that block went through the press. And so it's got to be the same ink because it's the same, right there. It's from the same impression, but it's a fraught, it's a fraught subject. I didn't think I probably wouldn't pay a big premium for any offset shade, at least. Maybe the emerald shade or the dark green shade you pay a little more for. It's unusual and much easier to distinguish. I think the thing I do is just I get a stock page and fill them up, line up all my offset shades by color and take it to stamp shows and just sort of hold it and compare. There's really no other rational way to do that, I think. And then for other shades, like, we talked about last time on the 2 cent, there's some tough lake shades. And there, I think you either gotta, you buy from a knowledgeable dealer and send it for a certificate, or buy one with a certificate or have one in your collection that you can compare, because those are those are tough also. Color is hard, and color is hard because we have a really bad memory for color, right? It's hard to look at a color and compare it later and see whether it's the same. And even if you have two stamps side by side, if you're not looking at it under the right kind of light, you can misjudge the colors. If there's fluorescent lighting or you're not in daylight, it can affect your perception of color. So it's a tough subject.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there's different types because the Bureau was making improvements to the photographs, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so then why did we end up with 528, but then we have a 528A and a 528B? Same with a 534, there's an A and a B. What's the distinction? Why did those happen?
The catalog numbering is a mess because collectors discovered a bunch of those varieties in the 30s after the catalog numbers were set. And so for a long time, it was really a mess. I have to look when it was. I think in the 50s or maybe the 60s, Scott tried to fix it, but they didn't have unused numbers. And so to do as little violence as possible to the catalog, they created those A and B numbers. Right.
So something that was discovered years later after the printing.
Yeah, that's right. It's also why Scott 533 and Scott 534B are less common and more expensive than the other types. Collectors just didn't realize they existed while the stamps were current. And so they were stuck, right? You discover it in the 30s, the stamps have been off the market for 10 years, right? And you're stuck with whatever you happen to have saved by happenstance.
I need a 534B. Anybody that has one, get a hold of me, please. Thank you. Okay.
I probably have a used single with Shermack perforations that's surplus to requirements.
Shermack. Okay, we'll talk.
Yeah. All right.
Got a hole in my album.
Yeah. And this probably goes without saying, but don't ever buy a 534B single without, or any 534B probably without a certificate. There's an awful lot of trimmed 534Bs floating around out there that weren't that are either had Shermack perforations or were wide margin 528Bs.
Yes.
But it's like it's like a $2,000 stamp, so it wouldn't get a certificate. Other questions, thoughts? Do folks have some offsets that they have trouble typing? They're telling apart?
It looked like there was someone in the chat who was asking if the Boston Lake color is recognized.
Oh, yeah, it's the specialists distinguish that. There's two different lakes on Scott 499. That's the more common one.
I got a question.
Yeah.
So the image size on offsets, are they a little shorter than even a flat plate?
It's a very good question. I've not actually, they're almost exactly the same size. The interesting part though is that none of the offsets are exactly the same size as the others. If you're really desperate, I didn't talk about this in the chart because it's too far in the weeds, but if you're really desperate, you can tell most of the types apart by measuring. They're slightly different dimensions. And also occasionally when the Bureau was using that little stamp size negative to make the printing plates, they didn't have it perfectly square to the plate. And so a number of the offsets aren't perfectly square. Now it's a matter of, tenths of a millimeter, right? It requires really careful measuring, but they're all sort of wonky sizes. But it's a good question, actually. I should know here.
Yeah, I superimposed and compared against flat plates and some rotaries that were horizontally printed and vertically printed, and the offsets seem to be a little more unpredictable and
yeah,
they line up with anything.
I should know this. I never thought. I just measured one. They're almost exactly the same size as the flat plates. The one interesting thing though was the offsets. Right, the flat plate stamps the paper was wetted before it went through the press, and so you have some shrinkage from the paper being wet. The offset process didn't require the paper to be moistened, and so I think there may be less shrinkage and a little more dimensional stability. if you're having trouble, and we talked about this a little before, but maybe, I'm not sure if everyone was on. If you're having trouble distinguishing the offset stamps from the engraved stamps, a couple of things you can do that are way easier than measuring. The one I like to do is I just take my thumbnail or even a stamp tongs, and if you just run it across the surface of the stamp, if it's bumpy, you can feel the ink on an engraved stamp with your fingernail, right? If you feel the bumps, you know it's engraved. If it feels perfectly smooth, it's an offset. Some folks like to get the stamp sideways and shine a light on it to see whether they can see the ink raise. I don't think I've ever had to do that, but that's another technique. I've seen people use really thin aluminum foil. You put it over the stamp and rub it with, burnish it. And if the image appears in the foil, then you know it's an engraved stamp. And if it's not, it's an offset. I think if you use it, yeah.
I'm aware of all those things. I was just curious about stamp size, image size compared to these other ways of printing. So and then I have one other question on some of your photos that showed especially the 2 cent, maybe it was in the other ones, I'm not sure. Were there like a 2 millimeter gap horizontally between the images and then maybe 3 between the vertical spacings? They seem different to me on your photos.
It may be, they should, well, it's a good question. The spacing is consistent horizontally and vertically between.
And vertically, well, it must have been an optical illusion for me.
Well, no, it's actually interesting. So within a few hundredths of a millimeter, it's the same in all of them, except actually that 3 cent block that I showed you with it, where there was a little strip of type 3 and then the big block of type 4. The type 3 stamps are half a millimeter shorter than the type 4 of the 3 cent. And so the vertical gap is a millimeter bigger. But even that's not, it's hard to see without a glass.
Okay.
The Bureau tried to use the same stamp sizes and the same layout as for the offsets as they did for the engraved. They made a few mistakes along the way.
I know for the 5/28 side, the 2 cents, I believe what I read in Armstrong is that they use the type 1 design from the engraved plates. So obviously they blow them up and shrink them down again. So you might be a little bit off, but.
Yeah, I think my recollection is the literature is unclear about which engraved die they use for the 2 cents, but for the 3 cents, that's absolutely right. They use the type 1 3 cent die, for 529, and they use the type 2 die, which is much, if folks remember, has much heavier lines. They use that for 530 and 535.
Yeah.
Just a quick question, Andrew.
Yeah.
With regard to the identification of used offsets, does that still apply if you rub a piece of tin foil on it? Because some of my offsets that are used are a bit rough.
Honestly, Ron, I've never tried to use the foil on a used one. I guess I've looked at so many of these, I can look at them and just tell.
I'm more of I could just take a look at them, really.
Yeah.
And I know that that's an offset.
I think still, even if it's rough, if you rub it, I would think if you rub the foil on a used one, the design is still flush with the surface of the stamp. You're not going to see the design appear in your foil.
Right.
But the other thing, if you're not yet in the ability just to look at it stage, the designs on the offsets are just quite different than the designs on the engraved stamps. You can easily look for some of those design differences we talked about. Either the toga rope will be much heavier, or the 526 has that DID thing, which is distinctive, and you won't see that on any of the engraved stamps. So if you're really not sure, just take a quick look at the design, and you should be able to distinguish it that way.
Right. Those characteristics on any of the used or any of my mint ones, I can all identify. So.
Yeah. And as I said before, if you get stuck, just make a scan, and my email address is here. I'll put it in the chat, but make a scan and send me an email. I'm happy to talk with you about it and help folks distinguish that. And for folks who are watching the video and not seeing the chat, my email is stamps, plural, @andrewkelley.net. And Kelley is Kelley. So stamps@andrewkelley.net. Always happy to talk Washington Franklin's.
you mentioned that to tell offsets, you could run your finger across and feel the different levels because the ink is on it. But
Mhm.
does magnification help you also?
Yeah, like if I have a stereo microscope that I use for expertising, and you can definitely on an engraved stamp, you can see the ink rising above the surface of the stamp, and an offset, you can see that it's flat.
It has to be stereo. I mean, will you see it at 30 power or you got to go more than that?
It's a good question. I've never actually, I've never tried. I'm so used to typing offsets just by looking at them. I don't know. Wayne, what's your experience with that? We can.
I'm sorry, with what?
The question was, can you see the raised ink on an intaglio stamp just using a loop magnifier? I think the answer is probably yes. I mean, I'm looking now.
Yes, it works much better with cross-raking light, you know, if you can get something at an angle. But you can generally see some rays, even just with as little as a 10 power magnifier.
Thanks.
No watermarks on any offset WFs?
No. There was a rumor, there was one article in the 20s where someone said they thought they found one, but then nothing ever came of it. So yeah, totally unwatermarked. The Bureau had abandoned watermarks long before the offsets came out.
Mhm.
And they use terrible paper. Like you have paper inclusions, paper fibers, super common. Particularly on the 1 cent stamps, you see lots of paper that is discolored, or the paper is very acidic and it started yellowing. It's just about the crappiest stamp paper I think the Bureau ever used. But again, there was a war on, right? They're trying to print the stamps as cheaply as they could.
So they're trying to save money, but yet they had to create all new equipment to print everything.
Well, remember they had the equipment from the revenues. The Bureau had been printing offset revenues for quite a while before they decided to print offset postage stamps. And so we think they just grabbed the revenue guys and used their presses and put them to work. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you see I get into this more in my exhibit than I did here just from space of time, but you can see, if you look at some of the varieties from the revenues and then the offset postage stamps, you'll see some commonalities. Like the revenues, was very common to write things in the margin, write the denomination, write the plate number. The revenue the plate numbers and the revenue stamps are positioned in a different spot often than they were on postage stamps. And so the first couple of offset postage stamps had the plate number in the wrong place because the revenue guys used the revenue conventions and not the postage stamp conventions. And then some of the varieties are the same. You'll see double impressions, you'll see over ink plates, under ink plates, that kind of thing where it kind of carries over from one to the other.
Little bit more casual approach to printing.
Yeah, and a huge time pressure. I mean, the Bureau, I don't remember the exact chronology, but the Bureau got approval from the post office on a Saturday. Back then, there was just one weekend day a week. Got approval on a Saturday to print offset stamps for the first time, lithograph postage stamps for the first time. And the Bureau printed the first stamps 3 days later. They were panicked. The public used, I think, 25 million 3-cent stamps a day. And right before the Bureau switched to offsets, they could only print 12.5 million a day. So they were in big trouble. I think quality control was super relaxed, and they just got to push the stamps out as quickly as they could.
And they were all printed out of the same location?
All printed at the BEP, yeah.
At the BEP, okay.
Yeah, different set of pressmen, but same building. And perforated the same machines too. The only part that was different was the printing.
What color guide do you use? Because you mentioned white wasn't interested in offsets.
There isn't a good color guide. My color guide is literally, I have a stock sheet with all the shades I found on the stock sheet, and I take it with me to stamp shows and compare stamps to see whether I have one or not.
So this is a stock sheet. It's a sheet with the stamps actually there.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not a picture of those stamps.
No, I mean, that printing exact color reproductions is tricky, so I just take the stamps.
Okay,
And I guess
understand.
when I call particular shades, though, what I like to do is have more than one example. Like I've seen dozens of that dark green shade on the 1 cent, for example. So I'm pretty confident it's a consistent shade, and that's the shade that Scott's after. Same thing for that emerald green, right? If you find one wonky color, maybe it's a print freak. If you find 20 of them, you can have more, at least a little more confidence that that is an actual shade. And so I've looked at enough of these, I try to get confident that I've seen the same color more than once. Is there, I can show one real quick. I keep talking about it. Give me 1 second. I want to show a page for my exhibit here. Right, because the problem is you have things like this. So I don't know if folks can see that, but right, here's a single block, and the stamps at the top are almost a completely different shade than the stamps at the bottom. I mean, this had to be the same ink, right? It was made on the same press impression, but these look quite different. And you also get weird, like the stamp at the left here, these weird printing freaks that are just, it looks like a super light shade. Part of that is the ink, and part of it is just a poor impression. That plate got under inked, or there was worn, or there was some other difficulty with it.
Okay, but the two stamps on that block of 6, two stamps at the top are the same color as the 2 stamps on the bottom, but they're different shades.
Well, I mean, they had to, this block came from one single revolution of the press. So these stamps were all printed with the same ink. And my point is, if you didn't have these as a block, if you just had these separately, you might think these are 2 different shades. That's why I'm really cautious, where I want multiple examples of the same shade to be sure that it's the shade. And even then, you got to be, humility and caution is the best advice I have, because it's really hard to tell that these are the same shade of ink.
Everything that you're showing us tonight, are those in your private collection?
Yeah.
Okay. And you live
where?
If you
really want to nerd out, I can send you a copy of my exhibit. I just didn't think people wanted to go through like 130 pages tonight.
When they went from printing in panes of 400 to printing in panes of 1600, they had those guides that you showed. What are those referred to? Do they still call them guidelines?
That guidelines.
Yeah.
And we think the pressmen just did that on their own initiative. Those weren't added. I mean,
Yeah.
someone took a marker and scribed those right on the plate. Yeah.
Right.
Because for the big plates, for the 400 and 800 and 1600 subject plates, the Bureau actually took an image that they would normally use for a 400 subject plate and just made multiple copies of it. Those had their own guidelines. We've seen those on like line pairs, or people have seen the arrow blocks.
Right.
That's something different. These were just, the Bureau put a mark on there so that when they put the top edge of the paper in the press, they had a line to aim for. Almost all of those guidelines are at the very, if you look at the proof sheets, they're at the very upper left corner of the big, they're all on the oversized plates, and they're the upper left corner of the big plate. And I think it gave the pressman a visual indicator of when he put the press in the paper, how far left or right he should put it.
Yeah, they're just crude registration marks. So they are.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
There Does Scott list them?
No, those aren't listed.
Like in the plate block with. Okay.
No, they don't list that. There are a couple other. I didn't get into it here, but there are a couple other varieties like that they don't list. At one point, pressmen scribed press numbers or press letters in the margins of the stamps. Super collectible, but not listed. There's some articles that catalog most of those varieties. I'd be happy, if folks are interested, I'd be happy to send them to you. Yeah. All right. Thank you guys for letting me prattle on about my favorite subject. You're a great audience. Appreciate it.
And you mentioned you have a book coming out, correct?
Well, I need to finish writing the book, but yeah, I'm about I'm about 80% done, which probably means I've spent 20% of the time on it that I need to spend. But what I did was, there are a couple of great references, like this Liebarger guy I keep talking about. He's a wonderful book, but he'll say things and you have no idea where he got them from, right? Or why he thinks a particular thing is true. He has a list of references at the end of the book, but it doesn't tie to any particular statement. So I got all those references. I've read basically everything that was written contemporaneously about the offsets.
Which book is this?
Donald Liebarger. Here, Liebarger. This looks like this. There's a
You
Jerry,
sent
there's
us
a
a PDF last week.
Yeah, and there's a link in the chat to this book. You can download this for free from the APRL. So look in the chat. Anyhow, so I took everything that Liebarger, all his citations, bunch of later work, and then there's been a ton of, and then the United States Stamp Society has done a ton of work on these issues over the last 100 years. So kind of gathered up all that information, just done us a bunch of original research and trying to have kind of a comprehensive like story of the offsets and visual depiction of all the varieties. So you're not looking at the Scott catalog wondering what a gash on cheek looks like. Like there it is. So I may enlist some folks in the script to help me proofread it once and give me some images of material once it's done. All right, any more questions, you guys?
No.
Oh, very informative. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Wait, I'm going to give Wayne the video, so he can distribute that. If people want the slides, you have my email. Let me know, or if people want to talk about offset stamps in even more excruciating detail, you know who to talk to. So
Okay.
thank you all very much.
In your mind,
Thank you.
for the rest of this calendar year, are you exhibiting that gas or no checks, or do you have plans to exhibit this year?
Yeah, for sure. I'm exhibiting the George Brett Cup at Rompex in May. So if folks want to come to Colorado, for May's the most beautiful month, come on out. And then I'm almost certainly going to exhibit at GAS, although I'm in the middle of changing jobs. So I got to make sure I can sneak away, but 98% chance I'll be at GAS. Yeah.
So I probably missed it in the beginning of of this Zoom meeting.
Mhm.
Is solely specific to offsets, or the one that you?
It is, yeah.
Now? Okay, good.
Yeah. No one's ever done it. So I thought it was the field was open.
Sure, very nice.
Thanks, Maverick.
Anybody?
Thank you guys very much.
Come to Westpex?
I've gone to Westpex every year for the last couple of years. I'm not sure if I'm going to make it this year or not.
Okay.
Again, I'm switching jobs and I got to make sure they're okay with me taking a bunch of weekends off to go to stamp shows.
Gotcha. All right. Just thought I'd ask.
Yeah, it's a great show. I'm hoping I'll make it out. Thank you guys.
Very good.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank
Nice
you.
presentation.
Thank you.
very
Great
much.
presentation. Thank you.